Hi, I'm Amanda Dubberly, Assistant Curator and Academic Liaison at UConn's William Benton Museum of Art, and I'm thrilled to introduce Emily Larned and Bridget Elmer. Emily has been publishing as a socially engaged art practice since 1993, when as a teenager she made her first zine. She is a co-founder of Impractical Labor in Service of the Speculative Arts, a union for reflective creative practice, and Alder and Frankia, an imprint for new collaborations and reissues of feminist material. Emily's award-winning artist books, zines, and publications are collected by over 70 institutions internationally, including the Tate, the Brooklyn Museum, the V&A, the Smithsonian, and are exhibited around the world. She graduated from Yale School of Art with an MFA in graphic design and is currently assistant professor of graphic design at the University of Connecticut Storrs. Bridget Elmer is an artist and educator working at the intersection of book arts, independent publishing, social practice, and public art. She is the co-founder of Impractical Labor in Service of the Speculative Arts and Print St. Pete Community Letterpress, and she currently serves as president of the College Book Art Association. Bridget's artist books and publications are collected internationally at institutions including the New York Public Library, Brooklyn Museum, Tate Britain, University of California, and Yale University. She received an MFA in the book arts and an MLIS from the University of Alabama and has taught at Penland, Oxbow, Florida State University, and Colorado College. Bridget currently works as coordinator of the Letterpress and Book Art Center at Ringling College of Art and Design, where she also teaches. Following the talk is a Q&A with Paul Michael, MFA student in studio art at UConn. Thanks so much to Emily, Bridget, and Paul.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to Amanda for the introduction. I'm here today with my friend and collaborator, Bridget Elmer. And today, both of us are going to share with you some thoughts about collaboration. So I'd like to start actually by just taking a look at the piece in the gallery. So that is a really large silkscreen print you see. The printed part is about 24 by 36 inches. And there's actually another print on the reverse of the back of that I'm going to show you in a minute, which really is about the process of silkscreen printing. And on that platform underneath, there's a stack of risograph prints, which was the original form that this piece took. And the typography from this actually all comes from letterpress printing, so which I'll get into in a minute. But you can see that already it's a very process heavy way of producing graphic design. It's not just like you make it on the computer and then you Command P and it comes out the other side. So here is the screen that was made in order to make the print. And if you've done any type of large format screen printing, you might know that it's really difficult to print something so large. And so it's really common for that to be also collaborative. And so I couldn't have printed this on my own. I really needed the help of my friend and colleague, Mark Zerolo, in the graphic design department. And he really, the two of us, actually pulling the prints together, that made it possible to print something at that scale. And so I'm grateful to him. So here is the piece that's hanging in the back of the exhibition piece that really shows more of the process of screen printing, things like bad prints or spraying the screen to keep it from drying out, and then it just starts dripping. Maybe like the registration isn't quite right or something doesn't quite fully print. Now, because it is from wood type, a lot of these sort of printing artifacts are actually on purpose, that it looks like this, where it's not like a perfect print. And so I think a really interesting thing about craft production is always navigating this point about what parts of the process do you want to be evident in the final piece and have that really be part of the piece, and what parts are actually not acceptable. What's your threshold of acceptability in craft? So something like this would really kind of bother me if it wasn't for an overall process piece. But something like this with the wood type, with the texture showing through, I really like that. Like I think of that as being part of the evidence of showing that it's letterpress, which, okay, so this is cool. This is a blown up picture of where I am right now when this quilt, this is from a few years ago, and the quilt was so much brighter. You can see how much like sun faded it's become over the years. So this is actually printing the first version of this project. Okay, so I've just been talking about like its form, but this wasn't made just to be like a print that hangs on the wall. This is a project called Surveying the State of the ILSA Union. And you can see here, it actually says surveying the second state of the ILSA Union. And so this is actually from printing the first state of the ILSA Union. And so what that was a survey that we sent to all impractical laborers, asking them to assess their working conditions as artists and makers. So how satisfied are they with their labor experience? You know, just because you're your own boss as an artist or maker doesn't mean that you actually give yourself good working conditions. Like how much autonomy do you have? How much opportunity do you have to experience belongingness? Do you have the opportunity to develop new skills? Are you so concerned with always like growing your business as an artist that it actually diminishes your experience of making art? So this is a survey that we sent to all members, which you might be a little bit confused about right now. You're like, well, what do you mean impractical laborers? What do you mean members? How does this all work? And Bridget is now going to tell you all about that. Take it away, Bridget Elmer.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm going to take a moment here to share my screen and speak with you a little bit more about impractical labor. So as Emily mentioned, impractical labor in service of the speculative arts, which we often call ILSA, is a union for reflective creative practice. And this union was established by Emily and I in 2008 as a collaboration. And it was really born out of our friendship and in the beginning, an engagement with letterpress, which we wanted to expand upon. And so we reached out to folks who were also working with what we deemed obsolete technology. And that's how this union was originally framed. It's a union for artists, makers, and creative practitioners of all kinds. And our focus as a union is on the immaterial working conditions of our members. Hence the union for reflection and creative practice. There's a valuation of process that's really at the center of our project and the union. And our motto is as many hours as it takes. So what you're seeing in this image is a collection of a lot of our initial publications, which is the way that we first started reaching out to potential members through publication, through letterpress printing and other varieties of printing, and obviously the design, the graphic design that goes into that. In addition to publishing those kinds of resources, we also, once we found our folks, our fellow union members, we started organizing participatory projects. And these are some images of an exhibition that we facilitated actually at our first convergence, our first meeting of all of the members that could come together. And this was a show called Hands and Tools. It's my hands and my tools. So you can get a sense of our focus on technology in the beginning. We also facilitate an annual holiday called the Festival to Plead for Skills, where we practice a skill, and we do this in a networked distributed way where we're all in our own studios. We call it working together alone. And we practice a skill on the 7th of July. And this is departing from a tradition, a Chinese and Japanese tradition and holiday of wishing for a skill. And with our union, we practice a skill together. And this is an example of me practicing setting type on a curve for the festival. And as I mentioned, our publications are really like the center of our practice, and they facilitate so much of what we do. This is an example of some printing for one of our recent participatory projects called ILSA Frameworks. And I want to share these images with you so you can kind of see the process where this is me printing in my studio several of these prompts for this project. So we're printing the prompts and a zine that accompanies it and sending this out to all of our members. Our members are receiving that and responding to that. And then they're sending all of that back to us. And in this case, back to us was back to a gallery in Nashville. And the gallery was called Unrequited Leisure. And you can see here, this is us receiving the packages. And here is the show. We have these prompts now on the wall with the responses from our members. And that becomes the collective collaborative artwork that we're sharing in the exhibition environment. So the exhibition is kind of the culmination of the project, but the project also continues. So these prompts and the answers to these prompts are what led us to our most recent projects that they really evolved from this project. So that's the way we work. It's very much a call and response, publication, collaboration model. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back to Emily so that she can speak a little bit about what has happened since we completed this most recent publication project. We have a couple of things in development that she's gonna share with you, and I will as well.
Oh, there you are. I was like, Bridget, I lost you on the side of the screen. You are back. A couple things that I would love to add to that hearing Bridget talk about it just reminded me. So first, I want to say that, so as we've been doing this since 2008, we've never been in the same place. So Bridget lives down in Florida. I'm up here in Connecticut. But even when we started, Bridget, were you in Alabama or North Carolina? You were in North Carolina, Alabama. You were in Alabama.
Yeah.
But then North Carolina, and then Florida, and then back to North Carolina, and then back to Florida, right? You've been in many places. I've pretty much just been in Connecticut and New York. But anyway, point being, even though we met in New York about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, since starting ILSA, we've always been very far away from each other. So actually Skype was really essential. I'd say for the first maybe 8 years of working, we always used Skype, and then we had more options that maybe were more reliable at times. And also I think a big part of ILSA, even though our members are incredibly important to us, and like being able to have like this larger community that we work with, right? That we get back from them that then allow us to develop new projects that then we give back, and then they do something with it and then they bring it back. Even though like that very iterative process is really important to ILSA, I also think a huge part of ILSA is actually just our friendship. Is when I think about ILSA, like I think of it as really, it's been an opportunity for us to really stay in touch over the past 12 years when we've been so far away from each other. And like, that is really so important to me. And I think that probably really resonates just about everybody right now in terms of feeling so far away from your people. It's just hard to feel connected. But I just want to say, stay strong. It's possible. It's been 12 years that we've been doing this and working this way.
There is hope.
Okay, that's right. We can do it. Not to say, I hope the COVID era last 12 years. Not at all. Not at all. That is not, no, no. Anyway, back to this. So this is how, again, our members would have experienced the mailer. So the Rezo print is folded in quarters, and it comes with a letter, and it's in this letterpress printed envelope. And so that's the cover when it's folded in in quarters. Again, you can see all of those were letterpress printed elements that were then brought into the computer, and then with some digital type that was added. Similarly, this letter was sent on March 21st of this year. And this, while the second State of the ILSA Union was something we were planning on doing before COVID happened, you know, we had done the first State of the ILSA Union in 2012. We felt like in another election year, it made sense 8 years later to check back in with people and see how their answers might have changed. We had no idea how radically affected everybody's, not only their creative practice or their work situation, but everybody's entire lives have been incredibly disrupted and changed by what's been happening this year. So this project is kind of taking a whole other, seems to mean something entirely different. But at the same time that we were asking our members to respond to this, we also launched a new project called ILSA, A Trying Time, a quarantine for working together alone. And so that project is really just about documenting members' responses to the earliest days of the pandemic. So basically from mid to late March into April. And so we had a deadline of the end of April where we asked people to submit. Now, of course, that's before so many other things happened, like the murder of George Floyd and the uprising for Black lives. So it was a very narrow period in the beginning where nobody knew what was happening and nobody knew how long it was going to last. Not like we know either of those things anymore, but it was just a very specific time. So in terms of thinking about how to give that a physical form, while we sent out the question via that letter, we also sent it to our email listserv, which is where we have a lot more members on the listserv. So basically anybody, it's free to join ILSA and join the listserv, but if you just want to receive the publications in the mail, that is $20 a year. It's a member subscriber, and anyone who is interested in participating is welcome to join. So in terms of collecting these responses, most of them came through email. So most people emailed their responses back. And then some people did mail things back to the studio here in Bridgeport. So I have some physical letters that I've been scanning, or postcards. So the concept for thinking about this publication is, again, really tied to this idea of time. So like a trying time, and just like the experience of time being so bizarre during COVID. Pretty early on, we had realized that we felt like the dates were really significant, like the date when somebody wrote their entry, again, because things just keep on changing. So what's interesting about this project is our earliest date is March 31st, and then I think the latest is maybe the end of April. But there's basically this design format is based upon a tear-off calendar, like a daily tear-off calendar with these big numbers. So this is for April 26th. So April 26th was a Sunday, and we might have had about like 10 or 12 people write in that day because it was towards the end of the deadline and it was a Sunday. And so that was like a day they had to do it. And then there's many other days since March 31st where there's nothing, right? So there's kind of like some days where there might be one, some days where there's nothing, and then some days where there's a massive thickening where it's just like a lot of stuff happens. And what we like about this is it also seems to kind of correlate to the experience of time right now, that you kind of don't know, like some days seem to go by super fast, other times goes really slow. There's like kind of this condensing and then expansion of time. And so this calendar idea kind of gets at it. You may be wondering like, oh, why is it black and white? This is actually designing for Rezo. So like the print files need to be all grayscale, and then they'll actually be printed in color. And each day of the week will be a different color. And so that also will be a way of looking at the outside of the book that you can see all the Mondays, all the Tuesdays, all the Wednesdays, all the Thursdays, like those will all be a different color. So that is what is going on with that. So that's currently in production. We hope to be sending it to all members maybe within a month. And now back to Bridget, who will talk about some other recent developments based upon what has been happening in the world.
Yes. So in developing the questions and processing the responses to both the second state of the ILSA Union and the quarantine, we were also contending with the fact that with our timeline, we generally facilitate a residency for our members every year. And it's usually in person. And it's usually a very small, intimate group. And it's all about imagining new ways of being through skill shares and readings and reflection, individual practice, shared meals, conversations. So we really weren't sure what to do in the COVID era, but we knew that there was a need for the cultivation of community. So this was also, the timing of it was concurrent with some of what Emily just mentioned, which is the murder of George Floyd and a re-engagement with Black Lives Matter and a whole new level of responsibility being felt by so many people for our current moment. And also combine that with the isolation that we were experiencing through the pandemic and a lot of fear and ambiguity. So we decided that we definitely needed to go forward with the residency, and we reached out to our members about that. And we decided to theme this residency, which would be our first ever virtual residency, though it was our 5th annual group residency, embodiment, which you may remember is one of the themes from our frameworks project. And it was open-ended. We reached out to our members and framed this opportunity with a couple of prompts, which I'll share with you here. That was also new. In the past, we had sort of facilitated this in more of an open way without necessarily committing to a series of prompts. It felt important to us to make a change to that part of the structure of the way we usually do things with the residency. And so we put forth these questions and we invited folks to contribute. And so what ended up happening was that we had an incredible experience with our members facilitating a variety of different offerings, everything from yoga and heart drone practice to a roundtable about print shops and fostering community in the pandemic, working with a slow productivity coach, abolitionist teaching, intentional giving, racial justice and a conversation about anti-racism, workshops with a disability justice advocate, and listening for liberation. And all of these offerings were offered generously by our members. And so it was a really incredible and like an experience of growth for all of us. And it has been something that we keep returning to as we look toward the future. And that kind of sums up where we are at this time. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share and just say thank you for the opportunity, Emily. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Oh, so happy to have you here. I just want to add one note about the residency, just again, how deeply collaborative that is too. So you've been talking about, of course, that all the offerings were member organized and they offered it themselves, but also the residency itself never would have existed if we didn't have an invitation from one of our members to come use his residency for an ILSA group residency. And we probably may not have done it this summer if it wasn't one of our members reached out and was like, hey, I have some time off and I was thinking about structuring it like an ILSA group residency. And then that made us realize, oh, maybe there really is a need. Like people actually would really like this. They're not totally just zoomed out and exhausted. And so again, deeply collaborative. So what you see in the faculty show website is really just like a very small piece, and I couldn't do it without all these other people. And so that's where I'd like to leave it off. and Paul. We look forward to hearing your questions. And thank you everybody for listening. And thank you, Bridget, for being here.
Thank you, Emily.
Hi all, really great to see you, Emily. Nice to meet you, Bridget. I appreciated hearing your talk. I have a few questions, if that's okay. And I wanted to start off by mentioning how I just love how Ilsa focuses on the working conditions of artists. And I know that in the arts community that creative people can often be hard on themselves. And in many ways, I think the pandemic has forced people, especially artists, to think about their own mental health in relation to productivity. So I'm wondering if you've learned anything unexpected from collaborating with this pool of artists in regards to art making.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it'll probably come as no surprise to you, Paul, that Bridget and I started Ilsa when we were in grad school because we felt like we really needed it, like for our own mental health, that we needed an opportunity to create another community that was outside of the specific fields we were in. I think over the years, something that I really value is learning from some of the people that we collaborate with. So with Ilsa, often what happens is, so we have these members who join, like maybe they hear about us from the internet or social media or word of mouth, like a person who's a member tells somebody, or they see a talk or they see a show. But sometimes what happens is some of those members emerge to become more involved. Like they reach out to us, they have an idea about something that they want to do, or they have an invitation to do something, or they invite us to do a show, and then that creates an opportunity to get to know them better. And then we often learn a lot from those individual members. So an example I think of is John Leibovitz down in West Virginia, who is responsible for us having an Ilsa group residency in terms of it's his residency down in West Virginia that he invited us to come to, but also from collaborating on a website project where we were trying having like a hand-coded blog for a little while that we ended up discontinuing. But through working on that, we discovered that he had a system for tracking his own personal chronobiology. And he would never, so he was a computer programmer and, you know, he lives in rural West Virginia. And so he had complete control of his schedule and he would never take a meeting in the morning. He was just very protective of his time. And he would always schedule meetings for like later in the afternoon because that was like not his best time. And he or like mornings, like he didn't want to talk to people. Like he just, he needed a few hours to himself and he stayed up really late at night, you know? So in talking to him about this, we're like, wow, you're so self-aware about how you feel about time. He's like, oh yeah, oh, well, I have this test that I did. And he showed us this little graph that he had made of how he learned this about himself because he just tracked how he felt at different times of the day for several days. And then he based his schedule around that. And we were like, that is amazing. We would love to share that with Ilsa and like turn that into a publication. And he's like, oh yeah, that sounds great. So the three of us collaborated on making time. And so that's like a self-test you can do to basically take John's test. So we just expanded it into more of a workbook and there's like a big test sheet you can take. But again, it really came purely from like a conversation with John. Like that project wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for him sharing something about the way that he organizes his time.
Wow, yeah. I think about your most recent residency, embodiment, and how the prompts ask members to imagine a future that they want to live in. And most importantly, how they can use the tools that they have available to them to reach that future. So I'm wondering if you find that many of these collaborations and projects open new possibilities for yourselves, for your members to kind of imagine the future. Oh, I think you're muted.
I had some background noise, but I am keeping myself from you. Sorry about that. Definitely. I feel that even more so in this moment, it is hard to think about the future because of the ambiguity that we're so close with right now. But something that I've realized through the residency and through some of the upcoming projects that we have in the works with Impractical Labor is the essential nature of reflection, which is really where our practice has moved. And not just reflection, but self-generated reflection, responsive to our current moment, but very specific to each individual. So what I'm thinking about here is with embodiment, it was we had prompts that led to that residency, but it was so open where people took that, and the experience that each of us had in the different panels or events that we were able to attend was in community, but also I know that we were all bringing and then taking from those conversations extremely different lessons and then potential paths forward. So I guess one of the things that I've been really strangely thrilled about is that, there are a couple of different things, like the way that Emily and I have been practicing from the beginning is in a distributed, networked manner where, we're meeting this way. This is the way that we've been connecting. And similarly, we've found our way to the need for reflection. And I think that that's reaffirmed. And for us, the model of asking the questions that are closest to our heart or reaching out to our members to ask them what is closest to their hearts is in that same call and response model moving us forward. So it's not just reflection, it's also changing our practice. So with every question and answers that we sort of process, we're changing and it's moving our art practice. But I also think for me, I can speak specifically, it's changing my life practice. It's changing the way that I work, in general. It's changing the way that I understand my place in the greater scheme of things. So I can tell you for myself personally that embodiment led me on a very important path of further self-reflection and education. And it led me to make some major changes in other organizations that I work with. Primarily, it led me to admit that I have an incredible amount to learn and to face in terms of the amount of work there is to be done. So, in a larger sense, I feel like the project does that for each of us as individuals, and we don't always know how. We don't always get to that specifically, what did this project do for you? That doesn't necessarily happen because we're moving on to a new set of questions that are, or actions that are motivated by the previous conversation. But I see the ripple effect, and I know that even for our project-based work, it's changing where we're heading, and two very good examples are that we're being invited by other groups, but other institutions that have a connection to ILSA one way or the other to come in and facilitate that same kind of reflection for their community. And that, in one example, that's an upcoming show at the Aldrich in Connecticut. And that show is about the election. And so we're going to be really pulling apart the ballot as a form, and that will be reflective with their community. And then next year we'll be heading to Florida to IS Projects, where they'll be having their 7th anniversary. But I mean, they've been a print shop, super interactive, book fair facilitator, exhibition space, active community-based space that has had to not completely shut down, but completely change. And so the idea of being there, facilitating, some questions for their community on the eve of their 7th anniversary, with so much having changed in the past year, is really powerful. Like that's going to lead to changes in their community. And so that's kind of not a totally new model, but something that's popping up more and more. And I see almost more in that the action of our reflection, I guess I would call it.
It's like the ripples,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if embodiment was like throwing the stone, and then these are like the ripples that continue.
And important to mention is embodiment was a theme from Frameworks, which was one of our recent publishing projects. And so are two themes that we've been meditating on, which is care and pace. And I would say that's really important in the context of your question, that though we know we need to work and there's so much action that needs to be taken, we also have realized like we also have to slow down. And the action that we take has got to be thoughtful and sustainable, which can be really frustrating because we all just want to do, because there is so much to do. But I wanted to make sure I mentioned that care and pace is something we're kind of in right now in terms of what we're contemplating. And that's also resonant for some of these other groups that are reaching out to us to collaborate.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I love that, especially just thinking about slowing down and considering the moment. I think that's really important. This is a little bit of a different direction to take our questions, but I sometimes feel like artists are encouraged to find a specific medium or a way of working and to stick with it indefinitely. And with Ilse, there seems to be a focus on coming together and sharing skills. So I'm wondering if you found that this has fostered more experimentation with your members and with your own studio practices.
Yeah, I know exactly that feeling you're talking about. And I think that's often associated as like a market pressure. Like in order for your work to be legible to like a contemporary art market, it has to be consistent, right? Like somebody has to be able to understand it. I think because Ilse, we're so much more in the relationship to a community than to a market, that we don't have that same weight, which is not to say that Ilse work really changes. It's really just all publishing and socially engaged art. But the idea of like artwork in relationship to a community rather than a market, I think is a really important one. It's definitely not Ilse's idea. Like Raymond Williams said this in like the late 60s, but it's something that I think continually resonates with me whenever I think about pressures of the market. I just remind myself that there's alternatives, and that can be a lot more open. And so for me, the skill shares, well, first, learning, the opportunity to learn new skills is one of the characteristics of satisfactory working conditions. So like that actually came from the Ilse Union survey. So things like autonomy, belongingness, challenge, recognition, opportunity, a feeling of commitment, that your personal values align with the work that you're doing. Those are all characteristics of satisfactory work. And so the opportunity to learn new skills is one of them. I think for many of our members, they are very tools and process based, and they really enjoy learning new skills that they do then bring back to their practice. For me personally, I like it just for a way of kind of opening up my understanding of the world. I feel like anytime I learn a little bit more about how to do something, especially things I don't know anything about, I just feel more connected. Like I feel more connected to other ways of like being and doing and making. And so I'm thinking specifically during a residency 2 years ago, Stina Soderling and Tristan Gordon did a couple of different skill shares around singing, listening, and movement. And those are all things that I'm just not really movement more comfortable with, but like singing, like what? And it was great. And I think that was, it was a pretty big residency that year. It was like 10 people. I mean, that's big for us. And I think that for in person, I think that created this I think the fact that people felt this kind of fear and anxiety about it, and then they tried it, and then everyone was kind of like really blissed out. It was like this really amazing experience where you just realize that more things are possible. It's just a different way of looking at the world. And so that's, for me, what learning new skills is about, rather than actually being able to use them productively to make something.
Also, yeah, I feel for myself, it's also about affinity. So like when I see other people practicing with other media, or when they're sharing their skills, I also am finding really unexpected affinities where it's like, oh my gosh, I see a connection between setting type and open source software, or, the weaving and like a certain part of my, like the movement of weaving and the movement of printing, like, and then it gets my mind moving in terms of the possibilities of what I might be able to learn if I even just delve a bit into something new. So it's both sort of like, can I get deeper into something that I'm trying to pull apart by delving into something new? Or can I just more deeply appreciate kind of like the larger whole of what I love about what I'm doing by seeing that affinity. And also, of course, the excitement of the connection there is always thrilling. And you find yourself potentially in this whole new world, not only of practice, but also of criticism and, pedagogy, and the history of those media or forms can be really exciting to again, delve into, to get deeper into what you might already be considering with your work.
And I think also ILSA members are really passionate about what they do. And so that's always just really fun, just seeing people talk and share about this thing that they know so much about. And I'm thinking, hearing Bridget talk, I'm realizing also things that I've learned from ILSA Skillshares, I've shared with my students, like even if I didn't incorporate them, something like psychogeography or like making a slipcase out of one piece of paper is something that I end up unfolding into my classes. And I think like the metaphorical quality of new skills is more clear. Like in terms of, I'm not a great knitter. I'm like a pretty okay knitter. My sister's like an amazing knitter. And so whenever I learn something a little bit more from her, I realize, as Bridget was saying, like what's transferable from that process. So I started doing cable stitches this summer, and I just realized that how helpful it is to be following a pattern that has so many instructions, because it has so much feedback that tells you when you're off track. And it just helped me appreciate how important really quick feedback is, as opposed to going too far along one way without anything to measure how you're doing, right? Like it's very easy to go too far down the wrong path if you don't have any feedback. So knitting, right, comes from knitting.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think especially just having a community come together where everyone has a very specific background or skill set that they are able to share, even if it's something that other people in the group don't continue to do. Just the ability to kind of think about their work, their practice from a different perspective is really important. And I do have one more question if I have enough time. Which I think kind of segues into what we were just talking about, which is just about the connections that you find the members of ILSA making with each other. So I appreciate hearing about your friendship as kind of being the center of all of this. So yeah, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how that's operated for other people in the community with connecting with each other.
That's a great question. And it is something that's I feel is very different in our kind of form as an organization. As I mentioned before, we work in a really distributed way, and we often say our unofficial motto is working together alone. So, obviously we're making connections. It is very rare that we're coming together as a whole group, we have our residency, but that's very small and specific. And we have had one event that was sort of like a convergence, and that also brought, you know, a limited number of folks together because we're so distributed all over the country and internationally. So that said, there are some really, like, there's sort of different models of connection. I think there are people who already know each other, and that's part of how they find ILSA. So you'll see sometimes collaboration happening either in the context of ILSA, or it might be inspired by or in relationship to something that we're facilitating as a group. And that's happening with some folks who actually already were connected, but now are also connected through shared membership. But we also definitely are seeing people find each other through ILSA. I think that's where we have a little bit less of an understanding of how much is going on, because, you know, for instance, with the residency, like, we did have one response that was a collective response. It was like, yeah, we want to do this panel. And they already had a group, you know, formed that they wanted to engage. And so those are kind of opportunities for us to see windows into the way that people are already connected. So I do think people are finding each other through Impractical Labor, though I don't necessarily think we're documenting like that kind of activity that's happening outside. We've talked about regional events, and we've always wanted to facilitate those. And that's been challenging because I think because of our model, and like the people that have joined, we're all very comfortable with working together alone. And so that said, you know, we try to put ideas out there like, oh, hey, it's Labor Day. We like to celebrate that together. You know, these are some ways you could potentially reach out and invite people to your space. Or the same happens with our festival every year. So we encourage people, if they're interested and they have the means or they have a project, like, to put that out there to the membership. And so definitely some of those kinds of connections are happening. But, you know, it would be really interesting. I'm glad that you asked this question, because I don't think we've ever asked that question of our members, like, hey, can you let us know? Can you tell us about anything that's kind of come from this that's happening like outside of our frame as an organization? Because I think we would be surprised. It would be so interesting to see if there are friendships or collaborations that are happening that we don't know about, that, you know, are either connected or potentially, you know, inspired by what we're doing as a group.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, because I was checking out the website too, just how you divided up each artist by state too. So there's the ability to kind of see who's local, who's a part of ILSA, and it just got me thinking. But yeah, appreciated hearing your thoughts.
I also feel like that's something we could remind people, because I sometimes even forget, and I'm like, oh, I need to check the Florida, you know, like I need to check the Florida list, or like I'm gonna go to North Carolina, I should check like the current North Carolina contingent. So it's something we could also probably use to remind everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Paul, we're actually super excited about adding you to Connecticut for the ILSA Union. Thank you for joining.
Yeah.
Yes, welcome.
Welcome to ILSA. Happy to have you.
Well, this has been great, guys. I feel like I've been able to more understanding about ILSA and hear about your practice, and yeah, it's been great to have this conversation with you.
We appreciate your questions. This has been really wonderful and reflective.
Indeed, generative, potentially. Thank you so much. It's been our pleasure.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Bridget.